please.
Like Gabriella, I'm also going to engage in somewhat of a global perspective, although one cannot disengage from Israel among the nations in that global perspective. The problem in confronting the international challenges, many of which are the underside of globalization, is not the absence of law or remedy, is not the absence of a global institutional framework as exemplified in the United Nations, but really the absence of political will, the indifference and inaction on the part of the international community. That's my first thesis today. The second thesis is that the United Nations, founded to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, the instrument for the promotion and protection of human rights, is itself, as has been pointed out, part of the problem rather than part of the solution. I say this more in sorrow than in anger. I grew up as a child of the United Nations. I grew up with the United Nations as having been the creature of Israel's birth certificate, of the United Nations as an organizing idiom of Canadian foreign policy, as a linchpin of international law. Regrettably, the United Nations, with respect to that mandate, has not only failed with respect to the implementation of its mandate, but has exhibited, and I'll get to that shortly, has exhibited on the one hand a culture of discrimination in singling out one member state for discriminatory treatment, and second, a culture of impunity where the major human rights violators have not been held to account at all. Let me give very quickly three case studies of what I mean of these two theses. And I'm going to begin with indifference and inaction, the dangers of this culture of indifference of inaction. And referring in particular here to the ongoing genocide by attrition in Darfur. We recently commemorated, as shocking as it may sound, the 5th anniversary of this genocide by attrition in Darfur, which passed almost unnoticed on the international radar screen, representing the banality of evil in our time. This, after over 400,000 have died, 3 million have been displaced, and 4.5 million are on a life support system. Indeed, the life support system itself is in need of life support. The whole betraying the people of Darfur, repudiating the responsibility to protect doctrine, an important doctrine adopted by the UN Security Council, and ignoring the lessons of history. One of those most important, compelling lessons of history, and I discussed it just this morning in a meeting with the Foreign Minister of Rwanda, is that the enduring lesson of history is that the killing fields in Rwanda and the Holocaust occurred not because of the machinery of death, but because of crimes of indifference, because of conspiracies of silence, which we are witnessing yet again today in Darfur. And what we are seeing with regard to Darfur is, in the first 5 months of 2008, almost the worst of what has been happening for the last 5 years. I'm referring to the fact that the Khartoum government has once again begun a scorched earth policy with regard to the indiscriminate bombing and burning of villages, has prevented the deployment, the effective deployment of the United Nations African Union hybrid protection force. And reminding us what Ambassador Gillerman said, that it is not necessarily the UN, but in this instance, the prevention of a United Nations authorized mandate in that regard, blocking the desperate humanitarian assistance, mocking the International Criminal Council. Arrest warrants have been issued by the International Criminal Court for those genocidaires in Khartoum, in Sudan, who were responsible for the planning and the implementation of this genocide by attrition. One of them, Ahmed Haroun, is not only the Minister of Humanitarian Affairs in Sudan, but a kind of Orwellian inversion of law and morality. After the arrest warrants were issued, the government of Sudan promoted him to be the minister responsible for the hearing of human rights complaints against the very atrocities which he himself perpetrated. And I can go on, but one gets a sense here in terms of what is needed at this point is for the international community to come together for a Darfur summit with all the representative actors and put in place an action plan to stop the killing fields in Darfur. The action plan is known, the political will is not there. Which brings me difference in action regarding Ahmadinejad's Iran. And here we have a failure on the part of the international community to act in the face of the state-sanctioned incitement to genocide in Ahmadinejad's Iran. Again, this is not a matter of the absence of remedy. There are a panoply of remedies. A fig leaf with regard to that kind of inquiry. I mention this because what disturbs me here is that what's at issue here is not simply, and with these words I close, is not simply the prejudice against Israel or the Jewish people in the manner in which I mentioned. What's at stake here is the integrity of the United Nations. What's at stake here is the authority of international law. What's at stake here is the whole legitimacy of the human rights movement, because some of what happened at Durban, for example, was aided and abetted not just by states, but by NGOs. And so at this point, we have to resolve ourselves, are we going to have a United Nations, an international set of institutions that are true to their founding ideals, or are we going to continue with the mockery of those ideals and in effect end up with neither effective international institutions nor effective protection of human rights or the kinds of genocides that we are witnessing in Darfur?